Greetings all, Ferrari Man 601 here. Welcome to Imola, welcome to the cockpit of the Ferrari F300, new to Assetto Corsa this week, courtesy of Virtua Simulazioni, the same people who brought us the Ferrari F1 concept, which was released at the end of last year, as well as the world-famous McLaren MP413, which was the first modern-era Premier League V10 Formula One car to come to Assetto Corsa. Since then, the MP413 has been joined by the F2002 and now the F300. Those of you who are familiar with the MP413 or any other work by Virtua will know that this is absolute world-class quality. Everything, textures, models, sounds, physics, brilliant. Absolutely brilliant in every regard. I've done a couple videos featuring the F300 thus far, including a very interesting comparison at Brands Hatch between the three V10 Formula One machines that Assetto Corsa now features with the introduction of this car, so I urge you to check that out as well. And for now, we're going to be doing a talk and drive similar to what I did with the F2002 a couple of weeks ago at Mugello. Today, of course, we are at Imola, and we're just going to go through the basics of how the car functions, its standard features, and just generally what it feels like to drive. So we've got the engine started. We idle at a nice even 4,000 RPM, which is expected from the 3-liter V10 from 1998. So clutch in first gear, very nice clunk from the gearbox. Clutch has a very fierce bite, as you would expect. And we are on the racetrack. Seven-speed semi-auto box, of course, with auto cut on the upshifts and auto blip on the downshifts, as you would expect. Here, there's wonderful backfires on the overrun. They are accompanied by graphical backfires at the tailpipes in the external views. So, an early morning here at Imola. We have a dusty circuit. So we won't be breaking any records today in terms of raw pace. But it should be more than sufficient for us to assess the F300 in its raw natural state. Not the best lighting for this right now, but you can see on the steering wheel, we have on the upper sections, we have to the left our speed, measuring in miles per hour, and the gear on the upper right. Below that, we have a fuel level showing the 33 liters on the left and then engine RPM on the right. And on the bottom, we have our current lap time. And then we have our last lap delta to the right of that. And that's about it for the steering wheel. The F300, obviously the car that Ferrari fielded in the 1998 Formula One season, powered by a 3-liter V10, hence the nomenclature of the car, 300. It is the successor to the F310 and the F310B of 1996 and 1997. Those were the first V10 cars that Ferrari fielded in Formula One. They derived their names from the 3-liter 10-cylinder arrangement, hence the 310. This is the 300. We're talking about 750 to 800 horsepower at about 16,000 revs. We'll rev all the way up to 17.5 rather. And as you can see, we've got a green track. We don't have enough grip to try anything too heroic today. Obviously, the car driven by Michael Schumacher and Eddie Irvine in 1998. They fought McLaren for the Constructors' Championship. McLaren, of course, won it in the MP413. As I mentioned before, also available from Virtua Simulazioni for use in Assetto Corsa. Just want to give you the opportunity to listen to the sounds this thing makes. Awesome. Get a nice clunk on the upshifts. It's actually really dramatic in the external views. And the throttle blips on the downshifts, very impressive, both in the cockpit and from the outside. Sounds a lot like videos I've seen of this car running in the real world. And in terms of a sonic environment, as a complete package, I have to say that this is probably the best I have come across in Assetto Corsa. It just feels so, it's tangible, almost, the sort of audio landscape that this car produces. It's gritty. All right, now we've got some heat in the tires and brakes. Like I said, we have a green racetrack, so all-out grip isn't there, but we can start to speak about the car's handling characteristics. First of all, it is a late 90s Formula One car, so we are wing-driven. We have a lot of topside downforce. Obviously, the faster you go, the more aero benefit you have, meaning that you can go into corners harder and faster, depending on your state of travel, I'll say. In that regard, the steering tightens up the faster you go as the download increases. Lower speeds, things tend to be a little freer, as you can see. Comparing things to the MP413, which is probably the closest analog to this, the F300 feels a little bit more, I don't want to say stable, but I'll say solid. It doesn't feel like there's as much roll in this car as there is in the MP413. The MP413, you'll see this on a lot of the videos that I've posted of the car, and certainly a lot of work by other people. It's very free, particularly on corner entry on the rear end. The car has a tendency to oversteer quite a lot. So you'll see a lot of steering acrobatics going on. This, not so much. The front and the rear, when they do break free, they tend to do it in unison, which is both a good and bad thing. Firstly, because the car does not have quite the tendency to oversteer. as the MP413, but at the same time, when things do break free, you lose all four corners at the same time, meaning that you've got no grip, in comparison to just having one end of the car doing its job but not the other. In terms of engine power, the engine is as you would expect from a car of this pedigree. Power delivery is very linear, it's very tractable. There are no dead spots really in the rev range, at least in the usable part of the rev range. There are no peaky bits. It's not like a turbo engine by any means. Of course, it's naturally aspirated. Very smooth. Power delivery is very direct, very predictable. The gearbox, it's a little tricky, I'll have to say. Yes, it's semi-automatic. No, you're not using the clutch when you're underway, but you'll notice my shift cadences on this car, on the downshifts. They're very deliberate. The downshifts tend to be more spaced out than they are when I drive cars of later years. The gearbox likes to have a negative acceleration applied to it on the downshifts. For example, you gotta be, what I mean by that is you have to be braking pretty hard in order to get those downshifts to come through. A lot of times what happens is it'll reject my downshifts if I do it too quickly to prevent me from doing an over rev, which is actually quite realistic, but it takes a little bit of getting used to. It's a timing thing, basically. Upshifts are not as crisp or direct as you would expect. Again, we're talking about a car from 1998. It has the technology to match. There is a considerable gap in drive as you pull the paddle for upshift. Because of that gap in drive, it encourages you to get the rear end stabilized before you decide to go for that upshift, because from the time the clutch cuts in and then the time it bangs back out again with the engine coming back on full song, you have lost enough torque transfer to the rear to unsettle things pretty substantially if the car is kind of skating along the surface. So you really want to make sure things are planted coming into the corner exit before you start going back up through the box. That being said, though, everything is quite responsive. There's no lag in terms of control input to completed shift, provided that you're not going into mechanical over rev, in which case it'll reject it most of the time. Brakes, they are as you would expect. Once again, very responsive. Once you get some heat in them, they're basically just like opening up a set of parachutes out the back of the car. The thing stops on a dime, within reason, of course. And because we're talking about a wing-driven car, you do have to practice some cadence braking as you go into corners, particularly ones that will bring you to a low speed. Because that downforce initially pushes the tires into the road. You're not going to lock them up, but as soon as you pass through about 100 miles an hour, that downforce goes away, and then you have to start being your own ABS. General handling characteristics. Like I said, the chassis feels solid. It doesn't have a lot of give to it. It's not very forgiving. It's very flat. It's harsh over bumps. If you hit curbs too hard, the car will break free. There doesn't feel like there's a whole lot of flex going on, which of course is good. You wouldn't expect that from a Formula car of any type anyway. steering response is nice. The force feedback is utterly and completely appropriate. Steering gets heavy at speed, it gets lighter at lower speeds. All the bumps and camber changes in the road, very nicely transmitted. Going over curbs and things like that, you know when you've hit them. And as you can see visually, this is the default eye position in the cockpit. I have not adjusted anything at all. You can see you've got great visibility all around. The mirrors actually work, which is a good thing. And generally, the car kind of lends itself to, it's going to sound weird in the context of a Formula car, but the car sort of wants you to drive it flamboyantly. I said before that the chassis is not particularly forgiving, but that really only applies to over bumps. If you're a little bit too aggressive on the throttle, like that, the back end will break free, and it gives you room to correct it. Again, it's on a knife edge because, I mean, it's a Formula 1 car, but it's not like a really high torque situation like you have in the modern turbocharged cars. It's just instant torque. It's like snapping your fingers and then the world falls apart. But this, you have room to kind of caress it across the apex if you want. A lot of my videos where I have a pedal trace, you might notice that depending on the kind of car I'm driving, I do like to sort of stab at the throttle, which some people like, some people don't. Has its advantages and disadvantages. This car lends itself quite nicely to that sort of instinctive driving style. Again, I've never run it with any sort of aids, so I don't know how those react, but if you're good enough, if you've had enough experience with things like this, you certainly don't need them. And as I demonstrated there, some short shifting in a high traction zone. If you've just overdone the throttle a little bit, that will generally save you. And we've got our fuel light on, of course. Not modeled in the cockpit, but you've got it in the upper left of the screen. You do, however, as I pointed out earlier, you do have your fuel quantity on the steering wheel, so that second row left side, the 7L, 7 liters remaining. go into the pits, of course, but if you haven't been able to divine this just by looking at the behavior of the car and seeing my inputs, be it in the pedals or in the steering wheel, the car's generally pointy. Certainly designed around Michael Schumacher. His onboard's full of steering adjustment, full of locked up front wheels, full of slides. He liked that very much. He liked the car to be free as much as possible, and this definitely allows you to drive it in that sort of manner. Of course, 1998 was his third year at Ferrari, so it would make sense that by this point they were able to really optimize the car design around him. So back to our pit stall. And that's about it. The Ferrari F300 by Virtua Simulazioni, new this week to Assetto Corsa. Thank you very much for watching.